Hello and welcome back, and today I want to continue looking at PCIe Gen 4 M2 SSDs. These new series of SSDs that are arriving in PCIe Gen 4x4 are getting more and more able to saturate the full potential 8,000 megabytes per second throughput on that particular channel. And although none of them have truly maxed it out quite yet, we're seeing lots of them in the mid to late 7,000 megabytes per second. Isn't that incredible? When you go back to the early days of SSDs, when they first came onto the scene and they were talking a big game early doors, that hard drives were giving you 150 megabytes per second, and these new SSDs would give you 370, 380 megabytes per second. And fast forward, we're at 10, 20, 30, 40 times those original speeds. It's absolutely insane. So why am I doing this series of videos? If you didn't catch the first one, what we are doing is looking at how the current range of available PCIe Gen 4x4 top tier SSDs from every single brand compare with the latest to enter the market, the Firecuda 530 from Seagate. Currently, that is the SSD score to beat. It's arrived in summer 2021, around about a month ago at the time of recording, and the majority of the other SSDs arrived somewhere between 12 to as little as 1 month prior to. And a lot of these SSDs have arrived with great bonuses and great extras, and they've been built incredibly well, but at the same time, some of them fall short in some ways from this behemoth that is the 530. And throughout these series of videos, I'm going to be comparing the Seagate 530 SSD with each one of them. Today, I think, is one of the most interesting contenders, one that arrived near enough a year ago, the Samsung 980 Pro. Arguably, until the Firecuda came along, the SSD of choice. It was hands down. If you were looking at PCIe Gen 4x4 M2 SSDs and you were looking for the best one out there, it won. It just won. It was one of the first to arrive on the scene. It was the first to crack the 7,000 megabytes per second read performance benchmark there. It was the first to exceed 1 million IOPS, which is insane, and that was near enough a year ago. So ultimately, the question is, the Firecuda 530, why so long? What does it bring to the party? And given the near 1 year difference of release between them, and the fact that the Samsung 980 has had plenty of time to get comfortable in the market to make its mark, both in terms of with client utilized devices and in photo and video editors, what has the Firecuda 530 got to offer you that the Samsung 980 with its large market recognition does not? So let's look at today's comparison. Let's talk about their strengths, talk about their weaknesses. Before we go any further, let's talk about what they got in common, because let's face it, not everything's got to be different. You know, these are still quite fast drives. I already mentioned they both hit the 7,000 megabytes per second read performance benchmark and exceed it in some cases. But let's talk about what they've got in common. First and foremost, they are both PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs, as mentioned, both doing a very good job of saturating the potential 8,000 megabytes per second, not filling it, but getting pretty darn close. Remember, bandwidth is the pipe and throughput is the water within the pipe in terms of read and write, but there are other benchmarks too. It's worth mentioning they both also take advantage of 3D TLC NAND. Now, for those not aware, triple layered cells, and 3D NAND is when it takes advantage of verticality in the way each of those layers go in. I will highlight that the Samsung 980 arrives with 128 layers, 40% higher than what came before. It's 128. I've not found anywhere that is 100% confirmed, but it looks like it is 128 layer NAND, whereas the Seagate Firecuda 530 arrives at 176 layer NAND, and that is going to translate later in the video in a number of ways. It definitely affects the price point, I would say, but also how it affects what these drives can do will play out and become a lot clearer as the video pans on. Also, I'll highlight, although both of them take advantage of NVMe protocol, there is actually a slight difference between them. They're both NVMe's, but the Firecuda arrives with NVMe 1.4 and the Samsung 980 Pro arrives at 1.3C. Now that is a small distinction, but in some ways it can be quite important, because that is effectively the revision of this kind of technology. If you think of SATA 1, SATA 2, SATA 3 and stuff like that, and dual SAS and SAS, it's very much the same thing. It is optimization and improvement of the protocol. But bear in mind that in order to get the fullest performance out of these drives, your device, your client device, better be using the latest version of NVMe as well. So if you are running an NVMe 1.4 system, you will be able to take advantage of the full banquet of performance enhancements of the Firecuda 530. But bear in mind that those extras that give it the edge in a number of areas that we'll touch on later on over the Samsung 980 may be fractionally clipped for you if you are running 1.3 or 1.3C or even an earlier revision like of NVMe 1.0, for example. So do bear that in mind. The last thing I'm going to touch on, both of them arrive with 5 years of manufacturer's warranty. However, I will also highlight, and I'll mention it later on in the video because I think it's pertinent, Seagate also include 3 years of rescue recovery services. And as I've mentioned in other videos, not everyone's going to take advantage of it. Rescue recovery services, a lot of you just go, I'm not going to use that, why should I pay extra for it? You're not paying extra for it. Well, you might be in the extra price difference between them. Shh, I'll get to that in a bit. But the rescue recovery services are actually pretty darn good. I've used them myself in previous videos in our testing, and ultimately, if you think you're in a scenario where you record lots of gaming for your YouTube channel or whatever, hi YouTube, and you're worried about any of that data getting corrupted or lost or an OBS index failure or something like that, there are ways in which data recovery services can help you retrieve those files. Likewise, if you are editing projects on the fly and you're mid-edits, you've got all your archive stock footage in your RAW and you're editing it using one of these SSDs as your editing drive suite, target drive, maybe got some migrating archive stuff there, then it has to be said that data recovery services, in the case of the interface failure, a PC power surge, any one of a number of things, those data recovery services, whether it be accidental deletion, or any one of a million ways that we lose our data, it's nice to have that. And anyone that's ever used professional data recovery services, you will know how much of a bugger it is when you lose data out of your control. It's so annoying. So yes, I do think it's worth touching on that inclusive recovery services, even if you never use it. It's like insurance. Better to have it than not have it. And if it's inclusive anyway, all the better. But let's talk about things that are different about these drives. Let's talk about those pros, cons, strengths, weaknesses. And one of the things that will be highlighted very early doors, I've got to say, is both price and capacity, because they've both gone very different ways on this. Now, unsurprisingly, the price point on the Samsung 980 Pros is more affordable. The reason it's more affordable, of course, is one, because of the NAND being utilised, those extra layers and its impact on the performance. That is not a cheap SSD from the 530, and I'm not saying that the 980 Pro is cheap. I'm saying that the architecture of the NAND is just that fraction bit more expensive on the 530. But the other big impact on price point is simply that the Samsung 980 has been around for a long time. And by a long time, obviously, these things are relative, but near enough to a year more, 10, 11 months, it depends on your region. It has to be noted that the Samsung 980s have had more time to go across the market, more time to grow and have more flexible price points. So you can generally find Samsung 980 Pros on offer at one retailer or another. They've been around long enough. They've had that time to get cozy in the market, that time to have more flexible pricing. And although, as mentioned in other videos, there is of course the impact of things like hardware shortages, semiconductor shortages, trade wars, Chia, the pandemic, that have made price points very hard to compare against one another, region to region, capacity to capacity. It has to be said that the Samsung 980 Pro is about $10 to $20 more less per terabyte compared with that of the Firecuda 530. So again, fair play to Samsung. They could have spent a lot more time throughout the last, again, dominance, the 9-10 months of them pretty much being the go-to drive for PCIe Gen 4x4, and could have really priced things up in the market. But these prices I'm talking about have largely been relatively affordable since their original launch. They went in a little bit lower than everyone else, and I think they did a very good job of it long term. Now, moving away from price, we can talk about the capacity stuff there, because I think that's very important to touch on as well. The capacity on these drives, they've very much got different directions. Now, the Samsung 980 Pro is available in 250, 500 gig, 1 TB and 2 TB. Now what's very important there is that little 250 gig model. Now the 250 gig model from Samsung is a really, really good idea. Now, not all of the NVMe PCIe Gen 4 M2 SSD manufacturers have included a 250 gigabyte drive. A lot of them just thinking 250 gig, there's no point. We can't fit that into our pricing strategy, our portfolio, our NAND and our development, our R&D. So they've just ignored it. And Samsung are one of the few brands out there that actually do have that 250 gig drive. And if you are looking for a drive for caching, great idea. If you're looking for a drive for smaller editing projects before you migrate over, and even, you know, if your projects knock around for about 40 to 50 to 100 gig, 250 gig is a nice little price there, knocking around for about 100 nicker. I think it's about $99, something like that. And that little SSD there, although it's not going to be great for premium gaming, and if you look at the scale of a lot of modern games these days, surpassing the 100 gig, it's not going to be great for multiple games. But if you run 1 or 2 games and you are happy to chop and change out, it's actually not bad value. And I think the 250 gig, a lot of these brands are missing a trick by just ignoring the 250. I get the lack of 120. There's not much you can do with 120 gig these days. Realistically, when you're mobile, we're seeing them arrive at 128. But 250 gig, I think it was smart of Samsung to keep that tier in their portfolio. Now, at the other end, we can talk about Seagate and the 530. The 530 arriving with a 4 TB model. That is ambitious. I mean, there isn't a lot of 4 TB NVMe's on the market as it stands, let alone PCIe Gen 4 M2 SSDs with this kind of performance. And it's not cheap. I've got to grant you, it's, $950, $1,000. It is not a cheap SSD. But once you break it down into the price per gigabyte or price per terabyte, it compares quite well against the 500 gig, 1 TB and 2 TB on the rest of their portfolio. And I think moving away from the smaller users that would look at that 250 gig drive and go, oh, that's lovely and convenient. At the other end of the scale, those of you that only want to make this purchase once, you don't want to have to go through this process of researching over and over again. Maybe they've enabled that PS5 storage expansion slot and you only want to do this once and you want to keep an enormous gaming library, or you are a video editor that's going to be dealing with 8K, or you have multiple users dealing with the same storage volume and you need that storage to be big enough to facilitate not only those projects but maybe versionings with them. 4 TB is where you're going to go. You're going to be making this purchase going, I want to go as big as possible and as reliable as possible, stick it in the basket. And I think Seagate have definitely looked at the other end of the market, that bigger end of the market, and gone, yeah, we'll have that one. And fair play to them, it does perform as good and better as every other drive in their portfolio. So, although I'm not going to say that either one of these two brands have won in terms of capacity, because I think the different directions they've gone in, clearly in their initial portfolios, have done them a very good job, I will say that there's something out there for different users. Moving away from price and capacity, I will also add that I think in terms of traditional read and write, the way the throughput we measure SSDs on so readily, I think both of these drives bring some of their biggest A-game performance across their entire product portfolios, across all of their ranges. And right now, both Samsung and Seagate can pat themselves on the back with these two drives. It has to be said, overall, Firecuda takes it in pretty much all of them. I mean, again, there is a relative comparison, and the WD Black 500 gig manages to eke out better performance, particularly in write. I was really surprised that the write of the 500 gig on the Firecuda 530 was so disparate. The disparity on them, 7,000 over 3,000, that was really odd to me. But after that 500 gig difference, and again, the Samsung 980 Pro does a very, very good job of that. Again, that's slightly, I'm not going to say lower, but that kind of what I would refer to as the SMB tier or the prosumer tier. I think they do a very good job of holding that in the 500 gig model at 6,900 over 5,000 of sequential read to write relatively. I would say they did a very good job there. but the minute you move into the terabyte areas, ooh, man alive, 1, 2 and 4 TB, the Firecuda just dominates. It caps out at a max 7,300 megabytes per second and 6,900 megabytes per second. So they're right at the highest tier, is equivalent to the read at the lowest tier, that 500 gig tier, I should say, of the Samsung 980 Pro. That's impressive. And again, that NAND, that controller are a big part of that. We could talk a lot more about SD RAM during this video and memory. We're not going to touch too much on those because I think a lot of that comes down to the overarching system as well. And of course, when we do the testing on a lot of this, we will be doing extended testing, none of your 5, 10, 15 minutes, because I think that is where the true proof of the pudding on these SSDs run. And when we get the overarching AJA, Blackmagic and Windows file transfer testing, that's going to be really interesting to see over an extended period. But in terms of traditional read and write performance, Firecuda 530 absolutely hammers it and wins it through all the way through to the end. Now, when it comes to SSDs, another area that people do have a tendency to focus on is IOPS, individual input outputs per second. Basically, if not latency, then the responsiveness of these drives in dealing with queries and data transmission. And the IOPS starts off pretty strong on the Samsung 980 Pro. They were one of the first brands out there to crack the 1 mil IOPS rating there in terms of read. And although I don't really rate IOPS outside of if you are utilising incredibly large amounts of processes at once, because even normal gaming doesn't have the input outputs per second to the local system as you would find in, say, a flash server or a data center. It is there, and with online multiplayer, it's kind of relative, but it's still communications with a central server with everyone at once. So there's overall a bottleneck there. But the IOPS between these two drives, they both managed to crack the 1 mil. 1 mil is cracked in terms of read and write on the 2 TB and 4 TB tiers of the 530. But the other one's slightly lesser than that. They're a little bit underwhelming. I'd say that 500 gig tier, especially when you compare the two drives, it's actually noticeably lower in terms of IOPS on the 500 gig tier than it is with the Samsung 980 Pro. Once again, showing that the Firecuda 530 is certainly, in its architecture, designed to really spread its wings as you go into the widespread NAND on the. It's worth remembering that the 2 TB and the 4 TB is a double-sided NAND, so the amount of capacity per cell is more spaced out, and of course that it's kind of reached its max the way you would find it on the one. So in terms of the 980 Pro, on the other hand, I would highlight that the 980 Pro still holds its own very well, even at the top tiers in terms of IOPS, and it maintains 1 mil IOPS read, a random read, in terms of write, weirdly on the 500 gig, but on the 1 and the 2 TB, it cracks it in read overall. And again, in terms of IOPS, I'm kind of inclined to give this overall to the 980. I do think the IOPS being 1 mil over 1 mil on the Firecuda 530 is good. It is good, and particularly when you get into those larger capacities. But IOPS, I find the minute you're in a situation where you're going to introduce 1 or 2 drives simultaneously, IOPS kind of gets to a point where you're getting bottlenecked by the system it is in. And although Samsung and Firecuda both provide that 1 mil IOPS, in terms of the bigger capacity drives at 1, 2 and 4 TB on the 530, I'm more impressed by the IOPS on the Samsung 980 Pro at its lower tiers being so high. And that's why I kind of give this point to them in terms of IOPS, because I think it's good that the smaller capacities can take advantage of it a great deal more, and they're the ones that you're going to stack up a bit more. But moving away from that, we can talk about endurance, we can talk about durability, we can talk about lifespans, because although both of these drives have got 5 years of manufacturer's warranty, which is damn standard for an SSD, I will say that the durability of these drives is actually very different. Now, the Samsung 980 Pro arrives with 0.3 drive writes per day, DWPD. That is effectively what percentage or decimal place of the drive can be filled per day and still maintain optimal efficiency and performance within that 5-year cycle. It is terabytes written divided by the years, the 5 years of warranty. Now, 0.3 is still good, And if you're going to be doing projects and editing on one of these drives, and the average project takes a few days to complete, and you move it to an archive, or you run a small handful of games that you run for streaming or professional content creation, 0.3 is okay. But the minute you look at data center, the minute you look at flash servers, the minute you look at 8K, the minute you look at projects where you have that scratch disk, you have that editing disk that you're going to be filling with a project. If not filling, then a large proportion of that drive is used by a project fairly regularly. And if you've got more than one editor doing it, that's when 0.3 data writes per day is less impressive and less convincing. And that's why when the Firecuda 530 was reported at 0.7 drive writes per day, more than double that of the 980, for me, on top of any of the stuff with layered NAND and NVMe utilization and the rescue service, that to me is what makes up the extra money. Because even if you don't utilize this drive at 0.7 data drive writes per day, so bear in mind if you had a terabyte, that would be 700 or so gigabytes of erasable data per day with the drive working fine. Even if you weren't to perform to that maximum write cycle, it still means this drive seemingly can take a lot of a hit even outside of the 5-year cycle. So do remember that drive writes per day is a bigger deal in the last few years as SSD technology becomes more integral and hard drive technology slowly gets moved to the archive and the long-term cold storage or warm storage. And that's why, for me, in terms of endurance, durability, and lifespan, you gotta give it to the 530. And ultimately, when comparing these two, the Firecuda 530 is still the better drive of these two. I've got to say, the Samsung 980 has been around, as mentioned, for the better part of a year, and it's done a damn fine job to basically cement itself in the minds of PCIe Gen 4 users, both client manufacturer and in their marketing and advertising, as well as in the eyes of the consumer. But right now, if you are thinking of buying a PCIe Gen 4 x4 M2 NVMe SSD, I would err you towards the Firecuda for the greater durability and endurance, for the large capacity being readily available, for the rescue recovery services included, and ultimately being the best value overall between these two drives. However, with the Samsung 980 being the better part of a year, the best part of a year old, bear in mind we may see a follow-up to this drive, and of course we will compare it when it comes, because the 980 was the 970, was the 960, so on and so forth. This series normally arrives every year to a year and a half, which could easily mean a follow-up to this drive in the relative near future, or at least announced before the end of 2021. So again, maybe hold out for that if things aren't so urgent, but if you need a drive right now, the 530 still stands out incredibly for most people. Just bear in mind that 980 Pro's lower capacities, that 250 and that 500 gig model, still do an incredible job to provide some of the best PCIe performance and best PCIe responsiveness that we've seen at those storage tiers from any brand. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. Take advantage of the free advice section over on NAS Compares via the link in the description. Genuinely free. Two guys, myself and Eddie, will answer your questions, whatever they are, about data storage, about the right kit you need for your home or business setup. We don't charge a penny. Take advantage of it. But other than that, I will see you on the next video.